The jaunt had opened the stars to mankind. It was supposed to be instantaneous, but time is a matter of perspective. The Jaunt by Stephen King. Read by Karl Wallace. This is the last call for Jaunt 701. The pleasant female voice echoed through the blue concourse of New York's Port Authority terminal. The path had not changed much in the last 300 years or so. It was still gungy and a little frightening. The automated female voice was probably the most pleasant thing about it. This is jaunt service to Whitehead City, Mars, the voice continued. All ticketed passengers should now be in the blue concourse sleep lounge. Make sure your validation papers are in order. Thank you. The upstairs lounge was not all grungy. It was wall-to-wall carpeted in oyster gray. The walls were an eggshell white and hung with pleasant non-representational prints. A steady, smoothing progression of colors matched and swirled on the ceiling. There were 100 couches in the large room, neatly spaced in rows of 10. 5 jaunt attendants circulate, speaking low, cheery voices and offering glasses of milk. On one side of the room was the entryway, flanked by armed guards and another jaunt attendant who was checking the validation papers of a latecomer, a heritage-looking businessman with the New York World Times folded under one arm. Directly opposite, the floor dropped away in a trough about 5 feet wide or perhaps 10 feet long. It passed through a doorless opening and looked a bit like a child's slide. The Oates family lay side by side on 4 jaunt couches near the far end of the room. Mark Oates and his wife Marilyn flanked the 2 children. "Daddy, will you tell me about the jaunt now?" Ricky asked. "You promised." "Yeah, Dad, you promised." Patricia added, and giggled shrilly for no good reason. A businessman with a build like a bull glanced over at them and went back to the fodder of papers he was examining as he lay on his back, his spit-shine shoes neatly together. From everywhere came the low murmur of conversation and the rustle of passengers settling down on the jaunt couches. Mark glanced over at Marilyn Oates and winked. She winked back, but she was almost as nervous as Patty sounded. Why not? Mark thought. First jaunt for all 3 of them. He and Marilyn had discussed the advantages and drawbacks of moving the whole family for the last 6 months, since he got notification from Texaco Water that he was being transferred to Whitehead City. Finally, they decided that all of them would go for the 2 years Mark would be stationed on Mars. He wondered now, looking at Marilyn's pale face, if she was regretting that choice. He glanced at his watch and saw it was still almost half an hour to jaunt time. That was enough time to tell the story. He supposed it would take the kids' minds off the nervousness. Who knows? Maybe it would even cool Marilyn's a little bit. "All right," he said. Ricky and Pat were watching him seriously, his son 12, his daughter 9. He told himself again that Ricky would be deep in the swamp of puberty, and his daughter would likely be developing breasts by the time they get back to Earth, and again found it difficult to believe. The kids would be going to the tiny Whitehead combined school with 100-odd engineering and oil company brats that were there. His son might well be going on a geology field trip to Phobos, not so many months distant. It was difficult to believe, but true. Who knows, he thought wryly, maybe it'll do something about my jumps too. So far as we know, he began, the jump was invented about 320 years ago, around the year 1987, by a fellow named Victor Caroon. He did it as part of a private research project that was funded by some government money. And eventually the government took it over, of course. In the end, it came down to either the government or the oil companies. The reason we don't know the exact date is because Caroon was something of an eccentric. "You mean he was crazy, Dad?" Ricky asked. "Eccentric means a little bit crazy, dear," Marilyn said, and smiled across the children at Mark. She looked a little less nervous now, he thought. Oh. Anyway, he'd been experimenting with the process for quite some time before he informed the government of what he had, Mark went on, and he only told them because he was running out of money and they weren't going to refund him. "Your money cheerfully refunded," Pat said, and giggled shrilly again. "That's right, honey," Mark said, and ruffled her hair gently. At the far end of the room, he saw a door slide noiselessly open and 2 more attendants come out, dressed in the bright red jumpers of the jaunt service, pushing a rolling table. On it was a stainless steel nozzle attached to a rubber hose, beneath the table's skirts, tastefully hidden. Mark knew there were 2 bottles of gas. In a net bag hooked to the side were 100 disposable masks. Mark went on talking, not wanting his people to see the representative of Lethe until they had to. As he was given the time to tell the whole story, they would welcome the gas passes with open arms, considering the alternative. Of course, you know the jaunt is teleportation, no more or less, he said. Sometimes in college chemistry and physics they called it the Karun process, but it's really teleportation. It was Karun himself, if you can believe the stories, who named it the jaunt. He was a science fiction reader. There's a story by a man named Alfred Bester. The Star's My Destination is called. And this fellow jester made up the word jaunt for it. Said in his book you could jaunt just by thinking hard about it, and we can't really do that. The attendants were fixing a mask to the steel nozzle and handing it to an elderly woman at the far end of the room. She took it, inhaled once, and fell quiet and limp on her couch. An attendant considerably readjusted her skirt while the other pulled off the used mask and attached a fresh one. It was a process that made Mark think of the plastic glasses in motel rooms. He wished to God that Patty would cool out a little bit. He'd seen children had to be held down. Sometimes they screamed as the rubber mask covered their faces. It was not an abnormal reaction as a child, he supposed, but it was nasty to watch, and he didn't want to see it happen to Patty. About Rick, he felt more confident. I guess you could say the jaunt came along at the last possible moment, he resumed. He spoke towards Ricky, but reached across and took his daughter's hand. Her palm was cool and sweating lightly. The world was running out of oil. Most of what was left belonged to the Middle Eastern desert peoples, who were committed to using it as a political weapon. They formed an oil cartel they called OPEC. What's a cartel, Daddy? Patty asked. Well, a monopoly, Mark said. Like a club, honey, Marilyn said, and you can only be in that club if you had lots of oil. Oh. Don't have time to sketch the whole mess in for you, Mark said. You'll say some of it in school, but it was a mess. Let's let it go at that. If you owned a car, you can only drive for 2 days a week, and gasoline costs $15 a gallon. Gosh, Ricky said, it only costs 4 cents to sell a gallon, doesn't it, Dad? Mark smiled. That's why we're going. Where are we going, Rick? There's enough oil on Mars to last almost 8,000 years, and enough on Venus to last another 20,000. But oil isn't even important anymore. Now what we need most of all is water, Patty cried, and the businessman looked up for his papers and smiled at her for a moment. That's right, Mark said. Because in the years between 1960 and 2030, we poisoned most of ours. The first water lift from the Martian ice caps was called Operation Straw. That was Ricky. Yes, 25 or thereabouts. But long before that, the jaunt was being used to find sources of clean water here on Earth. And now water is our main Martian export. The oil is strictly a sideline. But it was important then. The kids nodded. The point is, those things were always there. We were only able to get to it because of the jaunt. When Karun invented this process, the world was slipping into a dark age. The winter before, over 10,000 people had frozen to death in the United States alone because there wasn't enough energy to heat their homes. Oh, yuck, Patty said matter-of-factly. Mark glanced to his right and saw the attendants talking to a timid-looking man, persuading him. At last he took the mask, seemed to fall down on his couch seconds later. First timer, Mark thought. We can always tell. For Karun, it started with a pencil, some keys, a wristwatch, some mice. The mice showed him there was a problem. Victor Karun came back to his laboratory in a stunning fever of excitement. He thought he knew how Morse had felt. Now Alexander Graham Bell, and listen. This was bigger than all of them. Twice he'd almost wrecked the truck on the way back from the pet shop where he spent his last $20 on 9 white mice. What he had left in the world was 93 cents in his right front pocket and $18 in his savings account. But this did not occur to him. He never had, it certainly would not have bothered him. The lab was in a renovated barn at the end of a mile-long dirt road off Route 26. To make it turn onto this road where he had just missed cracking up his pickup truck for the second time, the gas tank was almost empty, and there would be no more for 10 days to 2 weeks. But this did not concern him either. His mind was in a delirious whirl. What had happened was not totally unexpected, no. One of the reasons the government funded him, even to the paltry tune of $20,000 a year, was because the unrealized possibility had always been there in the field of particle transmission. But to have it happen like this, suddenly, with no warning, and powered by less electricity than was needed to run a color TV. God, Christ! He brought the brat to a screech halt in the dirt of the dooryard, grabbed the box in the dirty seat beside him by his grab handles. On the box were dogs and cats and hamsters and goldfish, and the legend, "I came from Stockholm's House of Pets," and ran for the big double doors. From inside the box came the scurrying whisk of his test subjects. He tried to push one of the big doors open along its track, and when it wouldn't budge, he remembered he'd locked it. Croon uttered a loud "shit" and fumbled for his keys. The government commanded the lab be locked at all times. It was on the strings they put on their money, but Croon kept forgetting. He brought his keys out, and for a moment simply stared at them, mesmerized, running the ball of his thumb over the notches in the brass ignition key. He thought again, God, Christ. And he scrabbled through the keys on the ring for the real key that opened the barn door. As the first telephone had been used inadvertently, Bell crying into it, "Watson, come here," when he spilled some acid on his papers and himself, so the first act of teleportation had occurred by accident. Victor Croon had teleported the first two fingers of his left hand across the 50-yard width of the barn. Croon had set up two portals to opposite ends of the barn. On his end was a simple ion gun, available from any electronic supply warehouse for under $500. On the other end, standing just beyond the far portal, both of them rectangular on the size of a paperback book, was a cloud chamber. Between them was what appeared to be an opaque shower curtain, except the shower curtains are not made of lead. The idea was to shoot the ions through Portal 1, then walk around and watch them streaming across the cloud chamber, standing just beyond Portal 2, where the lead shield between to prove they really were being transmitted. Except that, for the last 2 years, the process has only worked twice, and Croon didn't have the slightest idea why. As he was setting the ion gun in place, his fingers had slipped through the portal. Ordinarily, no problem, but this morning his hip had also brushed the toggle switch on the control panel to the left of the portal. He was not aware of what had happened. He was sure he gave off only the lowest audible hum, until he felt a tingling sensation in his fingers. It was not like an electric shock, Croon wrote in his one-hour article on the subject before the government shut him up. The article was published, of all places, in Popular Mechanics. He sold it to them for $750 in a last-ditch effort to keep the jaunt a matter of private enterprise. There was none of that unpleasant tingle that one gets if one grasps a frayed lamp cord, for instance. It's more like the sensation one gets if it puts one hand on the casing of some small machine that is working very hard. The vibration is so fast and light that it is, literally, a tingling sensation. Then I looked down at the portal and saw my index finger was gone in a diagonal slot to my middle knuckle. My second finger was gone slightly above that. In addition, the nail portion of my third finger had disappeared. Croon had jerked his hand back instinctively, crying out. He so much expected to see blood, he wrote later, actually hallucinated blood for a moment or two. His elbow struck the ion gun and knocked it off the table. He stood there with his fingers in his mouth, verifying they were still there and whole. He thought he'd been working too hard, crossed his mind. The other thought crossed his mind. The thought set him up modifications might have done something. He did not push his fingers back in. In fact, Croon only jaunted once more in his entire life. At first he did nothing. He took a long, aimless walk around the barn, running his hands through his hair, wondering if he should call Carson in New Jersey, or perhaps Buffington in Charlotte. Carson wouldn't accept a collect phone call, a cheap ass-kissing bastard, but Buffington probably would. Then an idea struck, and he ran across the portal too. Thinking if his fingers had actually crossed the barn, there might be some sign of it. There was not, of course. Portal 2 stood atop 3 stacked Pomona orange crates, looking like nothing so much as one of those toy guillotines missing the blade. On one side of its stainless steel frame was a plug-in jack, from which the cord ran back to the transmission terminal, which is a little more than a particle transformer hooked into a computer feed line. Which reminded him. Croon glanced at his watch and saw it was 11:15. His deal with the government consisted of short money plus computer time, which was infinitely valuable. His computer tie-in lasted until 3 o'clock this afternoon, and then it was goodbye until Monday. He had to get moving, had to do something. I glanced at the pile of crates again, Croon writes in his Popular Mechanics article, then I looked at the pads of my fingers. And sure enough, proof was there. I would not, I thought, have convinced anyone but myself. But in the beginning, of course, it's only oneself that one has to convince. What was it, Dad? Ricky asked. Yeah, Patty added. What? Mark grinned a little. They were all hooked now, even Marilyn. They had never forgotten where they were. From the corner of his eye, he could see the jaunt attendants whisper wheeling their carts slowly among the jaunters, putting them to sleep. It was never as rapid a process in the civilian sector as it was in the military, he discovered. Civilians got nervous and wanted to take it over. The nozzle and rubber mask were too reminiscent of hospital operating rooms, where the surgeon with his knives worked somewhere behind the anesthesiast with a selection of gases in stainless steel containers. Sometimes there was panic, hysteria, and always there were a few who simply lost their nerve. Mark had observed two of these as he spoke to the children. Two men who had simply risen from their couches, walked across to the entry with no fanfare at all, unpinned the validation papers and affixed their lapels, turned them in, and exited without looking back. Jaunt attendants were under strict instructions not to argue with those who left. There were always standbys, sometimes as many as 40 or 50 of them, hoping against hope. Of those who simply couldn't take it left, standbys were left in with their own validations pinned to their shirts. Karun found 2 splinters in his index finger, he told the children. He took them out and put them aside. One was lost, but you can see the other one in the Smithsonian Annex in Washington. It's in a hermetically sealed glass case near the moon rocks the first space travel was brought back from the moon. Our moon, Dad, or one of Mars? Ricky asked. Ours, Mark said, smiling a little. Only one manned rocket fighter has ever landed on Mars, Ricky, and that was a French expedition somewhere around 2030. Anyway, that's why there happens to be a plain old splinter from an orange crate in the Smithsonian Institution. Because the first object we have was actually teleported, jaunted across space. What happened then? Patty asked. Well, according to the story, Karun ran back to Portal 1 and stood there for a moment, heart thumping, out of breath. Got to calm down, he told himself. Got to think about this. You can't maximize your time if you go off half-cocked. Deliberately disregarding the forefront of his mind, which was screaming at him to hurry up and do something, he dug his nail clippers out of his pocket and used the point of the file to dig the splinters out of his index finger. He dropped them onto the white inner sleeve of a Hershey bar he'd eaten while tinkering with the transformer and trying to widen its ferret capability. He apparently succeeded in that beyond his wildest dreams. One rolled off the wrapper and was lost. The other ended up in the Smithsonian. The splinter extraction finished, Karun felt a little calmer. A pencil. That was as good as anything. Took off from beside the clipboard on the shelf above him and ran it gently into Portal 1. It disappeared smoothly, inch by inch, like something an optical illusion and a very good magician's trick. The pencil had said Eberhard Faber No. 2 on one of its sides, black letters stamped on yellow painted wood. When he pushed the pencil in until all but Eberhard had disappeared, Karun walked around to the other side of Portal 1. He looked in. Saw the pencil in cut-off view as if a knife had chopped smoothly through it. Karun felt with his fingers where the rest of the pencil should have been, and of course there was nothing. He ran across the barn to Portal 2, and there was the missing part of the pencil, lying on the top crate. Heart thumping so hard it seemed to shake his entire chest, Karun grasped the sharper point of his pencil and pulled it the rest of the way through. He held it up and looked at it. Suddenly he took it and wrote, "It works," on a piece of barn board. He wrote it so hard that the lead snapped on the last letter. Karun laughed shrilly in the empty barn. To laugh so hard he started the sleeping swallows into flight among the high rafters. "Works!" he shouted and went back to Portal 1. He was waving his arms, the broken pencil knotted up in one fist. "Works! Works! Do you hear me, Carson, you prick? It works, and I did it!" "Mark, watch what you say to the children," Marilyn reproached him. Mark shrugged. "It's what he's supposed to have said." "Well, can't you do a little selective editing?" "Dad," Patty asked, "is that pencil in the museum too? Does the bear shit in the woods?" Mark said, and then clapped one hand over his mouth. Both children giggled wildly, but that shrill note was gone from Patty's voice. Mark was glad to hear. After a moment of trying to look serious, Marilyn began to giggle too. The keys went through next. Karun simply tossed them through the portal. He was beginning to think on track again now. It seemed to him the first thing he needed finding out was that the process produced things on the other hand exactly as they had been, or if they were in any way changed by the trip. He saw the keys go through and disappear. Exactly the same moment he heard them jingle on the crate across the barn. He ran across, really only charting now, and on the way he paused to shove the lead shower curtain back on its track. He didn't need it or the ion gun now. Just as well, since the gun was smashed beyond repair. He grabbed the keys, went to the lock of the government forced to put on the door, and tried the Yale key. It worked perfectly. He tried the house key. It also worked. So did the keys which opened his file cabinets, and no wonder started the pickup. Kroon pocketed his keys and took off his watch. It was a Seiko quartz LC with a built-in calculator below the digital face, 24 tiny buttons that allowed him to do everything from addition to subtraction to square roots. A delicate piece of machinery, and just as important, a chronometer. Kroon put it down in front of Porter 1 and pushed it through with a pencil. He ran across and picked it up. When he put it through, the watch had said 11:31:07, and now read 11:31:49. Very good. Right in the money. Only should have had a system over there to peg the fact there had been no time gained once and forever. Well, no matter. Soon enough, the government would have been wading hip deep in assistance. He tried the calculator. 2 and 2 still made 4. 8 divided by 4 was still 2, and so on. That was when he decided it was mouse time. What happened with the mice, Dad? Ricky asked. Mark hesitated briefly. There would have to be some caution here if he didn't want to scare his children, not to mention his wife, into hysteria minutes away from their first jaunt. The major thing was to leave him with the knowledge that everything was all right now. The problem had been rigged. As I said, it was a slight problem. Yes, horror, lunacy, and death. How's that for a slight problem, kids? Kroon set the box which read, I came from Stackhole's House of Pets, down on the shelf and glanced at his watch. Dan, if he hadn't put the thing on upside down. He turned around and saw it was 1:45. He'd only an hour and a quarter of computer time left. How does time fly when you're having fun, he thought, and giggled wildly. He opened the box, reached in, and pulled out a squeaking white mouse by the tail. Put it down in front of Porter 1 and said, Go on, mouse. The mouse promptly ran down the side of the orange crate on which the portal stood and scattered across the floor. Cursing, Kroon chased it, managed to actually get one hand up before it squirmed through a crack between 2 boards and was gone. Shit! Kroon screamed and ran back to the box of mice. He was just in time to lock 2 potential escapees back into the box. He got a second mouse, holding this one around the body. He was by trade a physicist, and the ways of white mice were foreign to him, and slammed the lid of the box back down. This one he gave the old heave-ho. It clutched at Kroon's palm, but to no avail. It went head over, riding a little pass through Portal 1. Kroon heard immediately wind on the crates across the barn. This time he sprinted, remembering how easily the first mouse had eluded him. He need not have worried. The white mouse merely crouched on the crate, its eyes dull, its sides aspirating weakly. Kroon slowed down and approached it carefully. He was not a man used to fooling with mice. He didn't have to be a 40-year veteran to see something was terribly wrong here. The mouse didn't feel so good after it went through, Mark Oates told his children with a wide smile that was only noticeably false to his wife. Kroon touched the mouse. It was like touching something inert, packed straw or sawdust perhaps, except for the heaving sides. The mouse did not look around at Kroon. It stared straight ahead. He had strode into squirming, very frisky, and alive little animal. Here was something that seemed to be a living waxwork likeness of a mouse. Then Kroon snapped his fingers in front of the mouse's small pink eyes. He blinked and fell dead on its side. So Kroon decided to try another mouse, Mark said. What happened to the first mouse? Ricky asked. Mark produced that wild smile again. It was retired with full honors, he said. Kroon found a paper bag and put the mouse into it. He would take it to the vet that evening. Moscone, the vet, could dissect it and tell if its inner works had been rearranged. The government would disapprove his bringing a private citizen into a project which would be classified triple-top secret as soon as they knew about it. Tough titty, as the kitty was reputed to have said to the babes who complained about the warmth of the milk. Kroon was determined the great white father in Washington would know about this as late in the game as possible. For all the scant help he had given them, he could wait. Tough titty. Then he remembered that Moscone lived way the hell and gone on the other side of New Paltz, and there wasn't enough gas on the brat to get him halfway across town, let alone back. But it was 2:03. He had less than an hour of computer time left. He would worry about the goddamn dissection later. Karun constructed a makeshift chute leading to the entrance of Portal 1. Really, the first jaunt slide, Mark told the children, and Patty found the idea of a jaunt slide from mice deliciously funny, and dropped a fresh white mouse into it. He blocked the end with a large book. After a few moments of aimless pattering and sniffing, the mouse went to the portal and disappeared. Karun ran back across the barn. The mouse was DOA. There was no blood, no bodily swings to indicate a radical change of pressure had ruptured something inside. Karun supposed that oxygen starvation might. He shook his head impatiently. It took the white mice only nanoseconds to go through. His old watch confirmed that time remained a constant in the process, or damn close to it. The second white mice joined the first in the paper sack. Karun got a third out. A fourth, if you count the fortunate mouse that escaped through the crack. Wondering for the first time which would end first, his computer time or his supply of mice. He held this one firmly around the body and forced his haunches through the portal. Across the room he saw the haunches reappear. Just the haunches. The disembodied little feet were digging frantically at the rough wood of the crate. Karun poured the mouse back. No catatonia here, but the webbing between his thumb and forefinger hard enough to bring blood. Karun dropped the mouse hurriedly back into the box and used the small bottle of hydrogen peroxide in his lab first aid kit to disinfect the bite. He put a band-aid over it. The rubber was dry until he found a pair of heavy work gloves. He could feel the time running out. It was 2:11 now. He got another mouse out and pushed it through backward, all the way. He hurried across the portal, too. The mouse lived for almost 2 minutes. It even walked a little after a fashion. It staggered across the Pomona orange crate, fell on its side, struggled weakly to its feet, and then only squatted there. Karun snapped his fingers near its head, and it lurched perhaps 4 steps further before falling on its side again. The aspiration of its side slowed, stopped. It was dead. Karun felt a chill. He went back, got another mouse, and pushed it halfway through head first. He saw it reappear at the other end, just the head, then the neck and chest. Cautiously, Karun released his grip on the mouse's body, ready to grab it if it got frisky. It didn't. The mouse only stood there, half fed on one side of the barn, half on the other. Karun jogged back to Portal 2. The mouse was alive, but his pink eyes were glazed and dull. His whiskers didn't move. Going around to the back of the portal, Karun saw an amazing sight. As he had seen the penicillin cutaway, so now he saw the mouse. He saw the vertebrae of its tiny spine ending abruptly in round white circles. He saw its blood moving through the vessels. He saw the tissue moving gently with a tide of life around its minuscule gullet. And nothing else, he thought, and wrote later in this popular mechanics article. It would make a wonderful diagnostic tool. They noticed the subtle movement of the tissues had ceased. The mouse had died. Karun pulled the mouse out by the snout, not liking the feel of it, and dropped it in the paper sack with his companions. Enough for the white mice, he decided. The mice die. They die if you put them through all the way, and they die if you put them through halfway first. Put them through halfway but first, they stay frisky. What the hell is in there? Sensor input, he thought, almost randomly. When they go through, they see something, hear something, touch something. God, maybe even smell something that literally kills them. What? He had no idea, but he meant to find out. Karun still had almost 40 minutes before Comlink pulled the database out from under him. He unscrewed the flaneur from the wall behind his kitchen door, tried back with the barn with it, and put it through the portals. The temperature went into 83 degrees Fahrenheit. It came out at 83 degrees Fahrenheit. He rummaged through the spare room where he kept a few toys to amuse his grandchildren with. Among them he found a packet of balloons. He blew one of them up, tied it off, and battered it through the portal. It came out intact and unharmed. A start down the road towards Entry's question about a sudden change in pressure somewhat caused by what he was already thinking of as the jaunting process. With 5 minutes to go before the witching hour, he went into his house, snapped at his goldfish bowl. Inside, Percy and Patrick squished their tails and darted about in agitation, and ran back with it. He shoved the goldfish through Portal 1. He hurried across to Portal 2, where his goldfish bowl sat in the crate. Patrick was floating belly up. Percy slammed slowly around near the bottom of the bowl as if dazed. A moment later, he also floated belly up. Crew was reaching for the goldfish bowl when Percy gave a weak flick of his tail and resumed his lackadaisical swimming. Slowly, he seemed to throw off the effect of whatever had happened, and by the time got back from the vet clinic that night at 8 o'clock, Percy seemed as perky as ever. Patrick was dead. Croon fed Percy a double ration of fast fish food and gave Patrick a hero's burial in the garden. As the computer had come out for the day, Croon decided to hitch a ride over to Mosconi's. According, he was standing on the shoulder of Route 26 at 3:45 that afternoon, dressed in jeans and a loud plaid sport coat, his thumb out, a paper bag in his other hand. Finally, a kid driving a Chevette, not much bigger than a sardine can, pulled over and Croon got in. "What you got in the bag, my man?" "Much dead mice," Croon said. Eventually, another car stopped. When the man behind the wheel asked him about the bag, Croon told him it was a couple of sandwiches. Mosconi dissected one of the mice on the spot and agreed to dissect the others later, and called Croon on the telephone with results. The initial result was not very encouraging. As far as Mosconi could tell, the mouse he had opened up was perfectly healthy, except for the fact that it was dead. Depressing. Victor Croon was eccentric, but he was no fool, Mark said. John attendants were getting close now, and he supposed he would have to hurry up, or he would be finishing this in the wake-up room in the Whitehead City. Hitching a ride back home that night, and he had to walk most of the way, so the story goes, he realized he had maybe solved a third of the energy crisis at a single stroke. All the goods that had to go by train and truck and boat and plane before that day could be jaunted. You could write a letter to your friend in London or Rome or Senegal. He could have it by the very next day, without an ounce of oil needed to be burned. We take it for granted, but it was a big thing to Croon, believe me, and to everyone else as well. "What happened to the mice, Daddy?" Rick asked. "That's what Croon kept asking himself," Mark said, because he also realized that people could use the jaunt that would solve almost all of the energy crisis. Then we might be able to conquer space. In his Power Mechanics article, he said that even the stars could finally be ours. And the metaphor he used was crossing a shallow stream without getting your shoes wet. You just get a big rock, throw in the stream, then get another rock, stand on the first rock and throw that in the stream, go back and get a third rock, and so on. And keep that until you made a pass with stepping stones all the way across the stream. Or in this case, the solar system, or maybe even the galaxy. Croon pretty much foresaw what had happened, Mark said. Drone robot ships programmed to land first on the moon, then on Mars, then on Venus, then on the moons of Jupiter. Drones really programmed to do only one thing after they landed. Set up a jaunt station for astronauts. Ricky said. Mark nodded. Now there are scientific outposts all over the solar system. Maybe someday, long after we're gone, there will be another planet for us. There are jaunt ships on the way to 4 different solar systems with planets of their own, but it'll be a long, long time before they get there. "I want to know what happened to the mice," Patty said impatiently. "Well, eventually the government got into it," Croon said. He kept them on as long as he could, but finally he got wind of it and landed on with both feet. Croon was nominal head of the project until he died 10 years later, but he was never really in charge of it again. "Geez, the poor guy," Rick said. "But he got to be a hero," Patricia said. "He's in the history books, just like President Lincoln and President Hart." "I'm sure it's a great comfort to him, wherever he is," Mark thought, and went on, carefully glossing over the rough parts. The government, which was pushed to the wall by the escalating energy crisis, did indeed come in with both feet. They wanted jaunt on a paying basis as soon as possible, like yesterday. Faced with economic chaos and an increasingly probable picture of anarchy and mass starvation in the 1990s, only last-stage pleading made them put off announcement for an exhaustive spectrographic analysis of jaunted articles could be completed. When the analysis were complete and showed no changes, the existence of the jaunt was announced with international hoopla. Showing intelligence for once, necessity is after all the mother of invention, the U.S. government put Young and Rubicam in charge of the PR. That was where the myth-making around Victor Croon and it was only a rather peculiar man who showered perhaps twice a week and changed his clothes only when he thought of it, began. Young and Rubicon and the agencies that followed him turned Carroon into a combination of Thomas Edison, Eli Whitney, Pecos Bill, and Flash Gordon. The blackly funny part of this, and Marcos did not pass this on to his family, was that Victor Carroon might even then have been dead or insane. Art imitates life, they say, and Carroon would have preferred with Robert Heinlein a novel about the doubles who go in standing for figures in the public eye. Carroon was a problem, a nagging problem that wouldn't go away. He was a loudmouth foot-dragger, a holdover from the ecological 60s, a time when there was still enough energy floating around to allow foot-dragging as a luxury. These, on the other hand, were the nasty 80s, with cold clouds befouling the sky, and a section of the California coastline expected to be uninhabitable for the next 60 years due to a nuclear excursion. Carroon remained a problem until about 1991, and then it became a rubber stamp, smiling, quietly, grandfatherly, figure seen waving from podiums in news films. In 93, 3 years before he officially died, he rode on the pace car at the Tournament of Roses parade. Puzzling, and a little ominous. The results of the announcement of the jaunt of working teleportation on December 19, 1988 was a hammer-stroke of worldwide excitement and economic upheaval. On the world money markets, the value of the American dollar suddenly skyrocketed through the roof. People who bought gold at $806 an ounce suddenly found that a pound of gold would bring something less than $1,200. In the year between the announcement of the jaunt and the first working jaunt stations in New York and LA, the stock market climbed a little over 1,000 points. The price of oil dropped only 70 cents a barrel, but by 1994, with jaunt stations crisscrossing the U.S. at the pressure points of 70 major cities, OPEC had ceased to exist, and the price of oil began to tumble. By 1998, with stations in most free world cities and goods routinely jaunted between Tokyo and Paris, Paris and London, London and New York and Berlin, oil had dropped to $14 a barrel. By 2006, when people at last began to use the jaunt on a regular basis, the stock market leveled off 5,000 points above its 87 levels. Oil was selling for $6 a barrel, and the oil companies had begun to change their names. Texaco became Texaco Oil Water, and Mobil had become Mobil Hydro 2 Ox. By 2045, water prospecting became the big game, and oil had become what it had been in 1906, a toy. "What about the mice, Daddy?" Patty asked impatiently. "What happened to the mice?" Mark decided it might be okay now, when he drew the attention of his children to the jaunt attendants, who were passing gas out only 3 aisles from them. Ricky only nodded, but Patty looked troubled as the lady with a fashionably shaved and painted head took a whiff from the rubber mask and fell unconscious. "Can't jaunt when you're awake, can you, Dad?" Ricky asked. Mark nodded and smiled reassuringly at Patricia. Carroon understood even before the government got into what he said. "How'd the government get into it, Mark?" Marilyn asked. Mark smiled. "Computer time," he said. "The database. That was the only thing that Carroon couldn't beg, borrow, or steal. The computer handled the actual particulate transmission, billions of pieces of information. It's still a computer, you know, to make sure you don't come through with your head somewhere in the middle of your stomach." Marilyn shuddered. "Don't be frightened," he said. "There's never been a screw-up like that. Never. As it was the first time," she muttered. Mark looked at Ricky. "How do you know?" he asked his son. "How did Carroon know you had to be asleep, Rick?" "When he put the mice in backwards," Rick said slowly, "they were right. As long as he didn't put them all in. They were only, messed up when he put them in head first, right?" "Right," Mark said. Jaunt attendants were moving in now, wheeling their silent cart of oblivion. Wasn't going to have time to finish this after all. Perhaps it was just as well. Didn't take many experiments to clarify what was happening, of course. The jaunt killed the entire trucking business kids, but at least it took the pressure off the experimenters. Yes, foot dragging had become a luxury again. The tests had gone for better than 20 years. Although Carroon's first test with drug mice had convinced him that unconscious animals were not subject to what was forever known as the organic effect, or more simply, the jaunt effect. He and Moscone had drugged several mice, put them through Portal 1, treated them at the other side, and waited anxiously for the test subjects to reawaken, or to die. They had reawakened. After a brief recovery period, they had taken up their mouse lives, with no ill effects whatsoever. These mice became the first of several generations that were studied with great interest. They showed no long-term ill effects. They did not die sooner. Their pups were not born with two heads or green fur, and neither did these pups show any of the long-term effects. When did they start with people, Dad? Rick asked, although they certainly read this in school. Tell that part. I want to know what happened to the mice, Patty said again. Though the giant attendants now reached the head of their aisle, they themselves were near the foot, Mark Oates paused a moment to reflect. His daughter, who knew less, had nevertheless listened to her and asked the right question. Therefore, if his son's question, he chose to answer. The first human doctors had not been astronauts or test pilots. They were convict volunteers who had not even been screened with any particular interest in their psychological stability. In fact, it was the view of the scientists now in charge, Croom was not one of them, he had become what is commonly called a titular head, that the freakier they were, the better. If a mental spaz could go through and come out all right, or at least no worse than he had been going in, and the process was probably safe for the executives, politicians, and fashion models of the world. Half a dozen of these volunteers were brought to Providence, Vermont, a site which had since become every bit as famous as Kitty Hawk, North Carolina had once been, gassed and fed to the portal exactly 2 hand miles apart, one by one. Mark told his children this, because of course all 6 of his volunteers came back just fine and feeling perky, thank you. He did not tell them about the purported 7th volunteer. This figure, he might have been real, or myth, or most probably a combination of the two, even had a name. Rudy Foggia. Foggia was supposed to have been a convicted murderer, sentenced to death in the state of Florida for the murder of 4 old people at a Sarasota bridge party. According to the Apocrypha, the combined forces of the CIA and the FBI had come to Foggia with a unique one-time take-it-or-leave-it, absolutely not to be repeated offer. Take the jaunt wide awake. Come through okay, and we put your pardon, signed by General Thurgood, in your hand. Out you walk, free to follow the 1-2 crossword, off a few more old folks playing bridge in their yellow pants and white shoes. Come through dead or insane? Tough titty. What do you say? Foggia, who understood that Florida was one state that really meant business about the death penalty, and whose lawyer had told him he was in all probability the next to ride old Sparky, said okay. The scientists to fill a jury box, with 4 or 5 left over as alternates, were present in the great day in December 2007. But if the Foggia story was true, and Mark Oates believed it probably was, I doubt if it had been any of the scientists who talked. More likely it had been one of the guards who had flown with Foggia from Rayford to Montpelier, and then escorted him from Montpelier to Providence in an armored truck. If I come through this alive, Foggia is reported to have said, I want a chicken dinner before I blow this joint. He stepped through Portal 1 and reappeared at Portal 2 immediately. He came through alive, but Rudy Foggia was in no position to eat his chicken dinner. In the space it took the jaunt across the 2 miles, Foggia's hair had turned snow white. His face had not changed in any physical way, was not lined or jowly or wasted, but it gave the impression of great, almost incredible age. Foggia shuffled out of the portal, his eyes bulging blankly, his mouth twitching, his hands spread out in front of him. Presently, he began to drool. The scientists who had gathered around him drew away from him, and no, Mark really doubted if any of them had talked. They knew about the rats, after all, and the guinea pigs, and the hamsters. Any animal, in fact, with more brains than an average flatworm. They must have felt like those German scientists who tried to impregnate Jewish women with the sperm of German shepherds. What happened? One of the scientists shouted. His repeater, to have shouted. It was the only question Foggia had a chance to answer. It's eternity in there, he said, and dropped dead of what was diagnosed as a massive heart attack. Scientists forgot that they were left with his corpse, which was taken care of by the CIA and the FBI, and its strange and awful dying decoration. It's eternity in there. Daddy, I want to know what happened to the mice. Patty, repeated. The only reason he had a chance to ask again was because the man in the expensive suit and the turn-aside shoes had developed into something of a problem for the jaunt attendants. He didn't really want to take the gas, and was discussing it with a lot of bluff bully boy talk. Attendants were doing their job as well as they could, smiling, cajoling, persuading, but it slowed them down. Mark sighed. He'd opened the subject only as a way of distracting his children from the pre-jaunt festivities, it was true, but he had opened it. Now he supposed he would have to close it as truthfully as they could without alarming them or upsetting them. He would not tell them, for instance, about C.K. Summers' book, The Politics of the Jaunt, which contained one section called The Jaunt Unto the Rose, accompanying the more believable rumors about the jaunt. The story of Rudy Foggia, he of the Bridge Club murders and the uneaten chicken dinner, was in there. There were also case histories of some other 30, or more, or less, or who knows, volunteers, scapegoats, or madmen who had jaunted wide awake over the last 300 years. Most of them arrived at the other end dead. The rest were hopelessly insane. In some cases, the act of re-emerging had actually seemed to shock them to death. Some section of jaunt rumors and apocrypha contained other unsettling intelligence as well. The jaunt had apparently been used several times as a murder weapon. In the most famous, and only documented, case, had been used several, which had occurred a mere 30 years ago. A jaunt researcher named Lester Michelson had tied up his wife with their daughter's plexiglass dream ropes and pushed her, screaming, through the jaunt portal at Silver City, Nevada. Before doing it, Michelson had pushed the nil button on his jaunt board, erasing each and every one of the hundreds of thousands of possible portals through which Michelson might have emerged. Anyone from neighboring Reno to the experimental jaunt station on Io on one of the Jovian moons. So there was Mrs. Michelson, jaunting forever somewhere out there in the ozone. Michelson's lawyer, after Michelson had been laid sane and able to stand trial for what he had done, within the normal limits of the law, perhaps he was safe, but in a practical sense, Lester Michelson was just as mad as a hatter, had ciphered a novel defense. His client could not be tried for murder because no one could prove conclusively that Mrs. Michelson was dead. This had raised the terrible specter of the woman to scorpio, but somehow still sentient, screaming in limbo, forever. Michelson was convicted and executed. In addition, some were suggested, the jaunt had been used by various tin pot dictators to get rid of political distance and political adversaries. Some thought that the mafia had their own illegal jaunt stations, tied into the central documentaries through their CIA connections. It was suggested the mafia had used the jaunt's nil capability to get rid of bodies, which, unlike that of the unfortunate Mrs. Michelson, were already dead. Seen in that light, the jaunt became the ultimate Jimmy Hoffa machine, ever so much better than the local gravel pit or quarry. All this has led to Summers' conclusions and theories about the jaunt, and that, of course, led back to Patty's persistent question about the mice. Well, Mark said slowly, his wife signaled with her eyes for him to be careful. Even now, no one really knows, Patty. With all the experiments with mice, animals, including the mice, seem to lead to the conclusion that while the jaunt is almost instantaneous physically, it takes a long, long time mentally. I don't get it, Patty said glumly. I knew I wouldn't. But Ricky was looking at his father thoughtfully. They weren't thinking, he said. They're test animals. So would we if we didn't get knocked out. Yes, Mark said. That's what we believe now. Something was dawning in Ricky's eyes. Fright? Excitement? It isn't just teleportation, is it, Dad? Some kind of time warp. It's eternity in there, Mark thought. In a way, he said. But that's a comic book phrase. It sounds good, but it doesn't really mean anything, Rick. It seems to revolve around the idea of consciousness. The fact that consciousness doesn't particulate. It remains whole and constant. It also retains some screwy sense of time. But we don't know how pure consciousness would measure time. If that concept has any meaning to pure mind. We can't even conceive what pure mind might be. Mark fell silent, troubled by his son's eyes, which were suddenly so sharp and curious. He understands, but he doesn't understand, Mark thought. Your mind can be your best friend. It can keep you amused even when there's nothing to read, nothing to do. But it can turn on you when it's left with no input for too long. It can turn on you, which meant it could turn on itself. Savage itself, perhaps consumes itself in an unthinkable act of cannibalism. How long in there in terms of years? 0.000000067 for the body to jaunt, but how long for the unparticulated consciousness? 100 years? 1,000? A million? A billion? How long alone with your thoughts in an endless field of light? And then when a billion eternities have passed, the crashing return of light and form and body? Who wouldn't go insane? Ricky, he began, but the jaunt attendants had arrived with their cart. Are you ready? One asked. Mark nodded. Daddy, I'm scared, Patty said in a thin voice. Will it hurt? No, honey, of course it won't hurt, Mark said. And his voice was calm enough, but his heart was beating a little fast. It always did, although this would be something like his 25th jaunt. I'll go first and see how easy it is. The jaunt attendant looked at him questioningly. Mark nodded and made a smile. The mask descended. Mark took it in his own hands and breathed deep of the dark. The first thing he became aware of was a hard black Martian sky as seen through the top of the dome which surrounded Whitehead City. It was night here, and the stars sprawled with the fiery brains undreamed of on Earth. The second thing he became aware of was some sort of disturbance in the recovery room. Mutters, then shouts, then a shrill scream. Oh dear God, that's Marilyn, he thought, struggled up from his jaunt couch, fighting the waves of dizziness. There was another scream when he saw attendants running towards their couches, their bright red jumpers flying around their knees. Marilyn staggered towards him, pointing. She screamed again and collapsed on the floor, sending an unoccupied couch rolling slowly down the aisle with one weakly clenching hand. But Mark had already followed the direction of her pointed finger. He'd seen. It hadn't been fright in Ricky's eyes. It had been incitement. She'd have known, because he knew Ricky. Ricky, who had fallen out of the highest crotch of the tree in their backyard in Schenectady when he was only 7. He was broken his arm. It was lucky that it had been all he'd broken. Ricky, who dared to go further and faster on his sideboard than any other kid in the neighborhood. Ricky, who was first to take any dare. Ricky and fear were not well acquainted. Until now. Besides Ricky, his sister still mercifully slept. The thing that had been his son bounced and writhed on his jaunt couch. A 12-year-old boy with a snow-white fall of hair and eyes which were incredibly ancient. The corneas gone a sickly yellow. Here was a creature older than time masquerading as a boy, yet it bounced and writhed with a kind of horrid obscene glee, and at its choked lunatic cackles the jaunt attendants drew back in terror. Some of them fled, though they had been trained to cope with just such an unthinkable eventuality. The old long legs twitched and quivered. Claw hands beat and twisted and danced in the air. Abruptly they descended, and the thing that had been his son began to claw at his face. Longer than you think, Dad, it cackled. Longer than you think. Held my breath when they gave me the gas. Wanted to see. I saw. Longer than you think. Cackling and screeching, the thing on the giant couch suddenly clawed its own eyes out. Blood gouted. The covering room was an Avery's screaming voices now. Longer than you think, Dad. I saw. Long jaunt. Longer than you think. It said other things before the jaunt attendants were finally able to bear it its way, rolling its couch swiftly away as it screamed and clawed on the eyes that had seen the unseeable forever and ever. It said other things, and then it began to scream. But Marcos didn't hear it, because by then he was screaming himself. The end.